So greetings from Pennsylvania once again, and it's the third day of my trip out here to northwestern PA. In this video we're going to focus on our French and Indian War series / Pontiac's War. I know I haven't been filming as much with it recently because we're kind of coming to the end of that series, but there were some other French forts that I've been wanting to get to for a while. It's just that they're farthest away from me up here in northwestern PA. We've done a lot about Fort Duquesne, which is where current day Pittsburgh is. We'll talk a little bit about that again today. I'll kind of refresh your memory about some things, but we're going to talk about the other French forts that were here in the Ohio Valley, where the area that the French and the British were vying for control of. But let me show you. Here is our map of Pennsylvania. Over here is the Ohio River Valley, is what is known. Of course, the British had settled this area over here. Most of this right here was all British territory. And over here, oftentimes it's called Indian territory, but the European powers were, fighting for control of this area, you could say. I mean, it didn't start out as fighting, but that's eventually what happened. So, yeah. So each acorn represents a French fort. Here's Fort Duquesne, here's Fort Machault, Fort LeBoeuf, and Fort Presque. I searched those French names up to pronounce them correctly. Hopefully I got that right, but yeah, so the reason for building a fort in these areas, because if you can build a fort, then technically the area belongs to you. That's kind of how it worked back then. The French already controlled the area up here. The Great Lakes area was kind of under their control. So they started by building a fort here, Fort Presque. That was built in the summer of 1753. Then they built this one here, Fort LeBoeuf. About a couple months later, about a month later. And they had to walk from here to here. This was the start. There's like a portage. They could sail here to Lake Erie. Then right here is right where about what they call the French Creek starts, and French Creek flows all the way down. But they had to, they couldn't. This part they had to walk. I think it was called the Venango Path. So that's why these two forts are too close together. This is kind of the beginning of the portage and the end of the portage. And here they could flow down to French Creek, down to Fort Machault, which was built the following summer in 1754. And what's kind of cool is that Washington, yes, George Washington visited some of these forts in the summer of 1753. If you remember your history, 1754 was the Battle of Jumonville Glen, when George Washington encountered some French forces, and that was kind of, in some ways, the beginning of the French and Indian War, as it was known worldwide as the 7 Years' War. But the year prior to that, in 1753, he made his way up to this area. The governor of Virginia sent him up there to figure out what the French were doing and to kind of talk with them, and to kind of he had a letter he wanted George Washington to give them, kind of telling them to get out of the area, that this area belongs to the British. But the French didn't really agree with that. They treated Washington okay, though, because they weren't at war yet. So I'm not sure if Fort Duquesne was being built at that time yet. I forgot my timeline a little bit off, but he did make his way up here to Fort Machault. But they sent him all the way up here to Fort LeBoeuf, where the commander of the forces were. And they received him nicely, read his letter, but basically said, no, we're staying. But they treated him well. But he was able to scope the area out a little bit and see what the fort looked like, how many men. I mean, and the French knew he was doing it, but it was, I don't think they really cared. But yeah, so we don't think of it, but he made it all the way up to here. He was quite traveled here in this part of Pennsylvania. Yeah, but then eventually the French they came all the way down here to build Fort Duquesne, where current day Pittsburgh is, because this area is important. This is where they call the forks of the Ohio. It's where the Ohio, the Allegheny, and the Monongahela River all meet. So this was an important area. So they had this whole line of forts. This was their most important one, but they had a chain, like a supply chain. So, and we've visited Fort Duquesne in the past, I think several times, because British tried to take it twice. Braddock's expedition in 1755, which was an utter failure, but then in 1758, the Forbes expedition was a success in actually capturing Fort Duquesne. But later today, the plan is to visit those other three sites where the other three French forts were: Presque, LeBoeuf, and Machault. I'll tell you a little bit more about them at those sites as well, because they have their own little history, separate from Fort Duquesne, but it ties in with Fort Duquesne as well. I might just point out a few other things on this map before I head out. I'm heading out to some other areas. I'm going up to Lake Erie. I'm going up to Presque anyway to visit the state park, but that happens to be where one of the forts is too. And on the way home, we'll visit the other two. At least that's the plan. Hope it works out. Yeah, so the British, they captured Fort Duquesne in the winter of 1758, December. There was a plan by the French. They had gathered forces here at Fort Machault to retake it in 1759. They're going to come down and retake it, which they might have been able to do. Unfortunately, of course, the war was beyond Pennsylvania. It was worldwide and all up in here too. But the British took what was called Fort Niagara, which is up that way. That basically cut the French off from this area, so they had to abandon these forts. So the French fled and just abandoned them, and then the British took them over. But then after the French and Indian War ended in 1763, and then Pontiac's War begun, because I have a video on that if you want to refresh your memory, these French forts that the British had taken over came under siege and were attacked. I'll talk more about that when I get to each of those sites in that history. But yeah, all right, let's get going. Let's get to those other sites. All right, so after visiting a number of other places today, we have made it to Fort Presque. You can actually see Lake Erie out there. They got a little monument for it right here. Yeah, out there you can see Lake Erie beyond all this industrial stuff. And actually Presque State Park is out there. Actually, Lake Erie may have been closer in the day to this spot, but right here is like a little, I guess kind of like a little replica of one of the bastions of the fort. But this is where the French built the fort. It was right here, because right here, check this out. This is called the Erie Stone. Check this out. The Erie Stone in 1795, Andrew Ellicott and General William Irvine arrived in the area to survey to lay out a town to be called Erie, using the southeast corner of the old French fort at the foot of Parade Street. And this is Parade Street right here where I park. So right here is where the old French fort was. Cool. So here they could have looked out over Lake Erie. Yeah. This was the first of 4 French forts built by the French names there to protect their claim to the Ohio River Valley. Built in 1753. Get some dimensions of it. You can pause the video and read some of that. Yeah. Yeah, it goes down to Fort LeBoeuf in Waterford. That's where we're heading next. Yeah, the fort was a supply depot for the other 3 forts ending at Fort Duquesne. The fort was never attacked and was abandoned by the French in 1759 after the loss of Fort Duquesne during the French and Indian War. Actually, they abandoned it after the loss of Fort Niagara, which is further up that way. They didn't abandon it after Fort Duquesne. This is kind of an example of what the French fort looks like. Because another fort was built here at a later time, but that's kind of beyond our concerns in this video. That heads up into like more Revolutionary era times. This one was built in 1760s by the British, though. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's right. They did rebuild it here. Yeah, it was attacked in June of 1763 during Pontiac's rebellion and fell after 3 days of spirited defense. Yeah, a little more to say about that in a moment here. Yeah, so the British did rebuild the fort, because when the French abandoned it in 1759, they burned it down. Because after they lost Fort Niagara, there really was no point. They couldn't really get to this area, so they had to abandon these forts. So they burned it so the British couldn't have it. And then the British did rebuild it, a spot here. It gets confusing because the British actually built another fort just down the way too. So, but yeah, so get during Pontiac's rebellion then. I think I talked about a little about this morning in my intro, which was hours ago. But yeah, unfortunately, in 1763 when it was attacked, when the British held it, it was attacked by the Native Americans. About 250 Native Americans attacked it. I think there were like 60 British. They were offered terms of surrender, which they took, but unfortunately those terms of surrender were not honored. When the British, they were promised that if they surrendered they could leave. Well, they surrendered, but as they were leaving, the Indians slaughtered them anyway, so it's kind of pretty brutal. But yeah, this was the first of the forts, and this was the start of the portage trail that took you down to Fort LeBoeuf. Because we got down to Fort LeBoeuf, they could take the French Creek and then the Allegheny River down to Fort Duquesne. So we're going to head down to Waterford next, where Fort LeBoeuf was. I think it's like 15-20 miles just down that way to the next fort. All right, a cool spot. Go take one last look. Yeah, so once again, here's where one of the corners of the fort stood. Actually, that's cool. That stone's been there since 1795. That's pretty cool. Yeah, but when the French were here, there'd been a much different view looking out that way. See Lake Erie, but this would have been a fort here. But look at it now, it's kind of a development. But that's progress. All right, but let's get out of Erie and head down to Waterford. It's a much smaller town. And we'll see if we can find Fort LeBoeuf. All right, let's get out of here, folks. Actually, we're gonna start heading home at this point too. This is where we kind of, in our journey, in my northwestern trip, we start turning southeast, I guess you could say. All right, let's get to let's get to Waterford. Let's get out of Erie. Yeah, so still making our way to Waterford, but I just passed one of those blue historical signs, and this is called the Old French Road. This is Route 97, so this is like the Portage Road, or close to it. It may not be an exact route, but we're right near that Portage route from Fort Presque to Fort LeBoeuf, so that's kind of cool. The Old French Road. Yeah, so we're about 10 miles from Waterford. We're kind of out of Erie and all that traffic and red lights and everything, so that's good. Alright, so we have made it down to Waterford. This is Route 19 right out here. We're at the south end of town. They have a museum here. I don't think it's open, but there's a historical sign up here. So right here was Fort LeBoeuf. You can see the sign for it's a museum. We got here. Yeah, remember motorcycle? Yeah, remember at the beginning of this video I talked about how George Washington visited this site. So, we got a ton of information here about that. We'll just quick look at a little bit of it. Most of it you know already. Built in the summer of 1753. Protect the Ohio country for the French Empire. Yeah, at the end of the 15-mile portage from Lake Erie. Of course, you could pause the video too if you read more of it. Yeah, the French Creek is nearby, and then they could take the French Creek down to Fort Machault and also to Fort Duquesne. And in fall of 1753, George Washington visited here. We talked about that at the beginning of the video. But yeah, like I said, I'm not gonna read all of it. Yeah, here's the Virginia governor's demands. The lands upon the Ohio River in the western parts of the colony of Virginia are notoriously known to be the property of the Crown of Great Britain. But the French didn't think so. As to the summons you send me to retire, I do not think myself obliged to reply. I'd read this historical sign. Looks like there's something over there. Oh, it's just a statue for George Washington. Yeah, 3 forts have stood on this site. The French fort, 1753, which was abandoned in 1759. We talked about that. And then the British fort was built here in 1760. Renamed it, of course. Then it was burned by the Indians in 1763 during Pontiac's War. And then it was built during the American Revolution too. I'm not sure if we can get across there. Too trafficy here, I think. Yeah, it's just kind of a memorial thing for George Washington over there. Maybe there's more information, but that road is nuts. But yeah, just like Fort Presque was abandoned in 1759 after the defeat of Fort Niagara, so was this fort too in 1759. Of course, the French took it over. They renamed it. That's what they did with the French forts. They take them over, renamed it. But like I said, during Pontiac's War, it was also attacked. But remember, Fort Presque was attacked. They offered terms of surrender, which they took, but then they were slaughtered anyway. The soldiers that were here at Fort LeBoeuf actually fled down to the next fort, Fort Machault. I think some of them survived. So somewhere in this area was Fort LeBoeuf. All right, but we're gonna head off south now to the town of Franklin, which I think is in Venango County, to where Fort Machault was located. And I'm pretty sure I'm saying the name right. I looked it up on Google or on YouTube or whatever I did, how to pronounce LeBoeuf. I wasn't sure about the F on the end. French is a little bit different because near me is a Machault State Forest. The end is spelled A-U-X, but it's not Machaut's State Forest, it's Machault. So sometimes these French words are a little bit different, but it's my navigation on there. Now we're gonna head a little ways further south to where Fort Machault is. And Machault has a T on the end, but you don't pronounce it according to what I saw. It's not Fort Machault, just Fort Machault, or something similar to that. All right, but yeah, very similar story to these. Of course, that's where in 1753, when Washington first visited, I think he stopped there first, and then came up. They sent him up here to Fort LeBoeuf. But yeah, but it was also abandoned in 1759 when Fort Niagara was taken, and it was also rebuilt by the British, renamed, I think, And then it was also attacked in 1763 during Pontiac's War and destroyed as well. I think a lot of them, some of the soldiers that were here in Fort LeBoeuf fled down to Fort Machault. A lot of them all fled then down to Fort Duquesne, which never did fall during Pontiac's War. We talked about that how there was a siege there. Anyway, a lot of information. Let's head down to Franklin, Pennsylvania, to Fort Machault. Now I realize some of this might get a little confusing. I'm throwing a lot of different dates and things at you, but it is kind of confusing. You know, they were originally French forts, then they were abandoned, then the British took over them, you know, but during Pontiac's rebellion, they were destroyed once again. But then during like the American Revolution, they were rebuilt again. So it's just kind of like a constant changing of hands and rebuilding. It's kind of the way it was with these. But they were at strategic locations. That's why they were important. If you remember Fort Machault, where we're headed next, that was the lowest of the third. That was the last one before you got to Fort Duquesne. But if you remember, Fort Duquesne was the most important one because it controlled the forks of the Ohio. And if you controlled the forks of the Ohio, you controlled the Ohio Territory. So these three forts we're doing today were kind of like support forts for that one. And also, because you remember I think I mentioned at the beginning of the video, at the end of 1758, the Forbes expedition, they captured Fort Duquesne, the British did. But the French were, before the fall of Fort Niagara, which was very important because that's when these French forts were abandoned, but prior to that happening, the French were going to make an attempt to recapture Fort Duquesne, and they were amassing troops down here at Fort Machault. But unfortunately, that never happened because, unfortunately or not, unfortunate for the French, it didn't happen. Because then, when the fall of Fort Niagara did happen, the French had to abandon that expedition, and then all these three French forts were then abandoned, as we mentioned a couple times already. Here's just a glimpse of the French Creek off to our side here. So I can try to film this safely while I'm driving, but yeah. So yeah, this was basically the highway that they would take when they were traveling down, you know, from Lake Erie. It's cool to think of it. Nowadays we're traveling on this modern highway, but there you go, the French Creek. Piece of history out there. Yeah, French Creek, a community treasure. All right. All right, we've made it to our last destination here. This is Elk Street. We're here in Franklin, here in Venango County. Actually, I think this is the first time filming in Venango County. Right here is 8th Street. There's also Route 322. I think there's a historical sign right up there for Fort Machault. It's going to say everything I've already talked about, so I don't think I'm going to try and cross this road to get there. But that's where it is. There's the sign for it. So somewhere right in this area is where Fort Machault was. I'm not exactly sure the exact spot, but here's somewhere. And what makes this area special for the fort was, because we talk about the French Creek, because remember, from Fort Presque to Fort LeBoeuf, they had to do a portage, like an overland route. Then once they got to LeBoeuf, they could take the French Creek. And the French Creek would come down here to Fort Machault. And from here, the French Creek joins the Allegheny River, the larger Allegheny River. And that Allegheny River then flows down to the forks of the Ohio, where Fort Duquesne was located. So that was the point of having a fort at this strategic location. I think that'll be it, folks. I think I've already said everything I need to say about this fort as well as we were driving along. It's got the same history as the other ones, pretty much. But yeah, I'm whooped, folks. Still got a ways to go home. I probably left something out about these forts. You know, this video is kind of scattered. I started this video in the morning, and I was making a couple stops on the way here. But anyway, there were other French outposts in the area too. These three forts today and the one down Fort Duquesne were military forts, but there were other French outposts in the area here in northwest PA and going over into like north central PA, because the French did a lot of fur hunting and trading in the area. So they had different outposts that were more just for trading and stuff. But when the war started, some of those outposts may have held soldiers at times too. And one other interesting thing I'll do a video on sometime, there's something called the Boone Road. It's this mysterious road that the settlers discovered when they started coming up this area. And some people think it was built during the French and Indian War by the French. I'm not going to get into that in this video, but that's something to do in the future. Mystery of the Boone Road. Anyway, I'm whooped, folks. I'm going to head home. Thanks for coming along. I probably missed something I wanted to say in this video, but that's okay. Thanks for coming along, folks, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one.